The sun never truly shone on the streets where I spent my youth, but I made sure it blazed a trail for my daughter, Sienna. My name is Eleanor, and for 30 years, my world was defined by the smell of industrial bleach, the rough texture of wool carpets under my knees, and the rhythmic scrubbing of other people's floors in the towering penthouses of Manhattan. My husband passed away when Sienna was just a toddler, leaving me with nothing but a small, drafty apartment in a neighborhood people usually tried to forget. I remember looking at my hands back then. They were young, but the skin was already beginning to crack from the cold water and harsh chemicals. I made a silent vow over Sienna's crib that she would never know the weight of a mop bucket or the sting of being looked down upon by people in tailored suits. I worked 3 jobs, starting my day at 4 a.m. in a commercial bakery and ending it at midnight cleaning office buildings in Midtown. Every dollar I earned was a brick in the fortress I was building for her future. I wore the same threadbare coat for 7 winters, telling myself that the chill I felt was worth the warmth of the private school sweaters I bought for her. I wanted her to walk among the elite, to speak their language, and to carry herself with the grace of someone who had never known a day of hunger. I didn't realize then that by scrubbing away the dirt of her reality, I was also scrubbing away her connection to me. I was teaching her that our life was something to be cleaned, hidden, and eventually disposed of. I saw the change start small, a slight cringe when I picked her up from school in my work uniform, the way she would walk a few paces ahead of me in public so people wouldn't realize we were together. I ignored the red flags because I was blinded by a mother's pride. I thought her desire to be more was a sign of ambition, not a seed of shame. When she got into an Ivy League university, I cried tears of joy, thinking I had won the war against poverty. Little did I know, the real battle, the battle for my daughter's soul, was only just beginning, and I was already losing it. The years at the university transformed Sienna into a woman I barely recognized, a polished gemstone that bore no trace of the rough earth she came from. It was during her senior year that she met Julian Thorne. The Thorne name was synonymous with American royalty, shipping magnates with estates in the Hamptons, and a lineage that traced back to the Mayflower. When Sienna first showed me his picture, her eyes didn't sparkle with the light of a girl in love. They glowed with the cold, hard ambition of someone who had finally found the key to a door she had been pounding on her entire life. She began to curate a new history for herself, a fictionalized version of Eleanor's daughter, where I was no longer a cleaning lady, but a private educator or a boutique consultant who was constantly traveling abroad. I watched from the sidelines as she meticulously scrubbed her social media of any trace of our cramped apartment, replacing photos of our humble Sunday dinners with images of her at gallery openings and polo matches. Then came the announcement of their engagement. I expected a celebration, a moment where she would finally introduce me to the man she intended to spend her life with, but instead I received a phone call that felt like a physical blow. She told me that Julian's family was old-fashioned and hyper-fixated on pedigree. She explained, with a clinical coldness that froze my blood, that it would be better if I didn't attend the wedding. "Mom, they expect a certain aesthetic," she had said, her voice trembling not with guilt, but with the fear of being caught. She promised me that once she was settled in the Thorne mansion, she would bring me to live with her, but for now, I had to remain a ghost. I spent her wedding day alone in my kitchen, wearing my best Sunday dress and eating a cold sandwich while the news outlets covered the social event of the season at the St. Regis. I saw photos of my daughter walking down the aisle in a gown that cost more than my lifetime earnings, her arm linked with a man who thought she was a blue-blooded orphan of high society. I told myself it was the ultimate sacrifice, that if my absence was the price of her crown, I would pay it. But as the months turned into a year of silence, the pride I felt began to sour into a deep, aching loneliness. I realized that Sienna wasn't just hiding me to protect her marriage, she was hiding me because she had come to believe her own lie. She had reached the top of the mountain, and she didn't want the person who had carried her there to remind her of the climb. The silence from the Thorn estate became a deafening roar in my small, empty apartment. For 6 months, I hadn't heard my daughter's voice, and the ache in my chest grew until it felt like a physical weight I could no longer carry. I told myself she was busy, that the life of a socialite was demanding, but deep down I knew she was simply hoping I would fade away like an old memory. One Tuesday morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my worn floral bag, the one with the frayed handles that had seen me through 1,000 commutes, and filled it with the only things I had left: a handful of childhood photos where Sienna was still smiling in my arms, and a batch of her favorite buttery almond cookies, wrapped carefully in wax taper. I boarded a bus to the Hamptons, watching the gray concrete of the city melt into the lush, manicured greenery of the wealthy elite. When I finally reached the Thorn estate, the sight of it took my breath away. It was a fortress of white stone and glass, shielded by massive iron gates and a security detail that looked at me with immediate suspicion. I felt like a smudge on a clean window as I stood there in my cheap polyester coat, clutching my bag. Just as the guard was about to tell me to move along, a sleek midnight blue SUV purred toward the gate. The window rolled down, and there she was. Sienna looked breathtaking. Her hair was a perfect honey blonde wave. Her skin glowed with the expensive care of someone who had never seen a day of stress, and a diamond the size of a marble sat on her finger. My heart leaped into my throat. "Sienna! Oh, thank God, it's me!" I cried out, stepping toward the car with my arms outstretched, hoping for a moment of recognition that would wash away the months of pain. But as our eyes met, I saw a look that was more terrifying than hatred. It was pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at me as if I were a ghost haunting her feast. Behind her, Julian leaned forward, his handsome face curious and kind. "Sienna, darling, who is this?" he asked. I saw the gears turning in her head, the desperate panic of a cornered animal. In that split second, she made a choice that would alter the course of our lives forever. She didn't open the door. She didn't call me Mom. Instead, she looked at her husband with a practiced, pitying smile and said, "Oh, Julian, look, it's Mary, the nanny I told you about from my childhood. I heard she had fallen on hard times after her husband died, but I didn't realize she was this desperate. She must have tracked me down to ask for a job." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I felt the cookies in my bag crumble as my grip tightened. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had bled for, and saw a stranger. She had not only denied me, she had erased Eleanor and replaced her with Mary the housekeeper. The heavy iron gates groaned open, not to welcome a mother home, but to admit a new piece of furniture into the Thorn estate. Julian, ever the gentleman, insisted that Mary be brought inside immediately. He looked at me with a genuine soft-hearted pity that felt like salt in an open wound. "It's incredible that you found us, Mary," he said as we walked through the towering mahogany front doors. "Sienna speaks of her childhood nanny with she speaks of you often." I glanced at Sienna, whose face was a mask of porcelain perfection, though her knuckles were white as she gripped her designer handbag. She led me away from the grand foyer with its crystal chandeliers and marble floors, steering me toward the back of the house where the air felt colder and the ceilings lower. We entered a small, cramped room located just off the kitchen, a space meant for a temporary live-in or a servant on call. The moment the door clicked shut, the mask of the gracious madam vanished. Sienna turned on me, her eyes flashing with a predatory, desperate fire. "What are you doing here, Mother?" she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper.
Do you have any idea what you've put at risk? Julian's father is the head of a legacy foundation. If he finds out his daughter-in-law is the child of a domestic worker, he will strip Julian of his inheritance and throw me onto the street. I looked at her, my voice trembling as I held up the floral bag. I just wanted to see you, Sienna. I brought your favorite cookies. I haven't heard from you in months. She snatched the bag from my hand and threw it onto the small, lumpy cot in the corner as if it were trash. There is no Sienna here, she snapped. In this house, I am Mrs. Thorne, and you are Mary. You will cook, you will clean, and you will stay in the shadows. If you even hint at the truth, I will lose everything, and I will make sure you are sent back to the city with nothing. Do you understand? I looked at the daughter I had raised to be a queen, realizing I had accidentally raised a tyrant instead. I saw the fear behind her cruelty. She was terrified of being found out, terrified of the poverty she thought I represented. For the sake of her unborn child, a grandchild I now knew was on the way, I bowed my head. "Yes, ma'am," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on that hard bed and listened to the sounds of a party happening 3 floors above me, realizing that I had finally entered the palace I always wanted for my daughter, but I had entered it through the servants' entrance, and my name had died at the gate.
The sun rose over the Atlantic, casting a golden hue on the Thorne estate, but for me, the daylight only brought a new kind of darkness. My transformation into Mary was complete. My morning began at 5 a.m., long before the house stirred, as I prepared the specific high-alkaline green juices and organic breakfasts Sienna demanded. I became a ghost in the hallways, draped in a drab gray uniform that felt like a shroud. I watched my daughter navigate her new life with a chilling level of theatricality. To the world, she was the sophisticated, philanthropic wife of a billionaire. To me, she was a taskmaster who seemed to find pleasure in my degradation. It wasn't enough that I was hiding the truth. She seemed determined to punish me for the very existence of that truth. She would intentionally spill red wine on the white Persian rugs just to watch me scrub them on my hands and knees, whispering, "Make sure it's perfect, Mary, we have guests tonight." Julian, ironically, became the only source of warmth in that cold stone fortress. He would often wander into the kitchen late at night while I was prepping the next day's sourdough, leaning against the marble island with a tired smile. "You have a gift, Mary," he'd say, watching my hands work the dough. "The house feels different since you arrived, more like a home." I would keep my eyes down, my heart screaming to tell him that the gift he tasted in the bread was a mother's love, the same love that had fueled 20 years of packed lunches and birthday cakes. Sienna would inevitably interrupt these moments, her voice sharp and brittle as she'd command me to polish the silver or check the humidity in the wine cellar. She lived in a constant state of high alert, a soldier behind enemy lines, terrified that a slip of the tongue or a familiar glance would blow her cover. The most painful part was the psychological distance she created. She began to speak about her mother in the third person during dinner parties I was forced to serve. I stood there, holding a heavy silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, as she told a group of New York elites how her late mother had been a concert pianist who died in a tragic accident in the Swiss Alps. I felt the tray tremble in my hands, the weight of her lies heavier than the silver. She looked me straight in the eye as she told this story, a silent challenge in her gaze, daring me to shatter the crystal-clear lie she had spun. In those moments, I realized that Sienna didn't just want me to be a servant, she wanted me to be invisible. She wanted to erase the Eleanor who had scrubbed floors so she could become the Sienna who pretended she had never seen one. I was no longer a person to her.
I was a living, breathing evidence of a past she had murdered, and every chore she gave me was another shovelful of dirt on the grave of our relationship.
The humidity of the late New York summer settled over the estate like a heavy blanket, but the atmosphere inside the Thorne mansion was even more stifling. Julian's mother, Beatrice, a woman whose blood was as cold as the diamonds she wore, had arrived for a week-long visit. She was a woman who saw everything and forgave nothing. One afternoon, while I was reaching up to polish the crystal wall sconces in the library, the collar of my uniform shifted. Hanging from my neck was a small, delicate gold locket, the only piece of jewelry I had ever owned. Inside were two tiny, grainy photos, one of my late husband on our wedding day and one of a toddler-aged Sienna laughing in a park. It was my talisman, the only thing that reminded me I was Eleanor, a woman who was loved, and not just Mary, a woman who cleaned. Beatrice entered the room with the silent grace of a predator. Her eyes, sharp as needles, immediately locked on to the gold glimmer at my throat. "That's an interesting piece, Mary," she remarked, her voice dripping with a feigned curiosity that made my skin crawl. "It looks remarkably like a locket I saw in a portrait Sienna once showed me, a portrait of her supposed socialite mother." My heart stopped. I felt the blood drain from my face as I instinctively reached up to cover the jewelry. Just then, Sienna walked in, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray as she realized what was happening. For a second, the silence in the library was so thick it felt like it could shatter. Sienna, ever the strategist, didn't panic. She let out a forced musical laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Beatrice, you have such an eye for detail. I actually gave that to Mary a few months ago. It was a charity piece, really. It belonged to my mother, but it was so old-fashioned that I figured Mary would appreciate the sentiment more than I would. It's a bit of a hand-me-down for a faithful servant, don't you think?" The cruelty in her words was a jagged blade. She was calling my most prized possession, the symbol of my marriage, a piece of charity trash. Beatrice narrowed her eyes, the suspicion not entirely gone. "A bit sentimental to give away a family heirloom to the help, isn't it, Sienna?" That night, after the house had gone quiet, Sienna burst into my basement room. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't apologize for the insult. Instead, she lunged for my neck, tearing the locket from my skin with such force the chain snapped. "Are you trying to ruin me?" she screamed in a hushed, frantic tone. "I told you to be invisible. This locket is a dead giveaway. If Beatrice starts digging, she'll find out the concert pianist was actually a woman who cleaned toilets in Queens." She threw the locket into the trash can near my bed and stood over me, trembling with a mix of rage and terror. I sat there staring at the broken gold in the garbage, realizing that my daughter hadn't just taken my name and my freedom, she was now stripping away my memories. I looked up at her, my voice a hollow shell of what it used to be. "That was your father's gift, Sienna. It's all I had left of him." She didn't even flinch. "My father is dead, and if you don't start acting like a ghost, Eleanor, so is your life in this house." As autumn's chill began to turn the vibrant leaves of the estate into brittle skeletons, the tension within the walls of the Thorne mansion reached a breaking point. Sienna was now heavily pregnant, her belly a prominent reminder of the new generation about to be born into this web of lies. For Julian, it was a time of pure, unadulterated joy. He was a man who valued legacy above all else, and the thought of a daughter to carry on the Thorne name filled him with a gentle radiance. But for Sienna, the pregnancy was a ticking time bomb. She became increasingly erratic, her hormones amplifying her fear of exposure into a state of near-constant paranoia. She began to see my presence not just as a burden, but as a threat to her child's future.
She convinced herself that if I so much as touched the baby, my poverty would somehow rub off on it, or worse, that the child would instinctively recognize the blood bond and scream the truth to the world. The physical toll on me was becoming unbearable. Despite my age and the mounting stress, Sienna refused to lighten my workload. In fact, she intensified it. I was expected to move heavy oak furniture to make room for the nursery, to hand scrub every inch of the mahogany railings with lemon oil, and to stand for hours in the humid kitchen preparing specialized meals for her prenatal diet. One afternoon, while I was carrying a heavy tray of sterling silver tea service up the grand staircase, my knees buckled. I didn't fall, but the clatter of the silver against the tray echoed like a gunshot through the silent house. Sienna appeared at the top of the stairs, her face contorted in a mask of disgust. "You're getting slow, Mary," she spat, her voice cold and devoid of any daughterly concern. "If you can't handle the basic requirements of this household, perhaps you're too old to be of use to us. I won't have a clumsy, broken-down woman hovering around my daughter once she arrives." I stood there, gripping the banister for support, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to scream that I was broken down because I had spent 30 years carrying her on my back. I wanted to tell her that the clumsiness was the result of a life spent in service to her dreams. But then Julian emerged from the nursery, his face etched with worry as he saw me swaying on the steps. He rushed down and took the heavy tray from my hands, his touch kind and respectful. "Mary, you're white as a sheet," he said softly, turning to Sienna with a frown. "Sienna, she's exhausted. She's been working 18-hour days. We have a dozen other staff members. Why is Mary doing the heavy lifting?" Sienna's eyes flashed with a momentary panic before she smoothed her features. "I just want things done right, Julian. You know how sentimental I am about Mary. I trust her more than the new hires." The irony was a jagged pill to swallow. She trusted me to work myself to death because she knew my love for her would keep me silent. Later that night, she cornered me in the pantry, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Don't you ever play the victim in front of my husband again," she warned, her finger inches from my face. "You aren't a grandmother here. You aren't a mother. You are a service provider. And if you make me look like a villain in my own home one more time, I will have you removed by security, and I will tell Julian you were stealing. Do you understand?" I looked at her, seeing the hollow shell of the girl I had loved, and realized that the blue blood she so desperately coveted had finally turned her own heart to ice.
The winter of 2026 arrived with a brutal, icy wind that rattled the window panes of the Thorne estate, and with the first heavy snowfall, the house was jolted into chaos. Sienna went into labor 3 weeks early. The mansion, usually a place of hushed whispers and curated silences, became a whirlwind of paramedics, frantic phone calls, and Julian's nervous pacing. I stood in the shadows of the kitchen, my hands trembling as I brewed pot after pot of coffee for the waiting family, my heart racing with a mixture of terror and an overwhelming primal joy. My grandchild was coming. The blood of my husband and the legacy of my own hard-working parents were about to take a new breath. I found myself instinctively reaching for the locket that was no longer there, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in months to keep them both safe. Hours later, the news broke through the house like a sunbeam. A healthy baby girl. They named her Clara, after Julian's grandmother. When the chauffeured car finally brought them back from the hospital, the house was transformed into a floral cathedral. The elite of the Hamptons sent bouquets of white lilies and peonies that cost more than my monthly rent in Queens. I waited in the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my uniform. I just wanted one glimpse, one moment to see the continuation of my life. But as Sienna was wheeled through the front door, she saw me standing there, a hopeful smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Her expression instantly hardened into a mask of stone.
She clutched the bundle in her arms tighter, shielding the baby's face as if my very gaze were a contagion. "Mary," she said, her voice sounding like the snap of a whip in the quiet foyer, "the nursery needs to be sterilized again, and I don't want you near the East Wing for the next few days. The baby is very sensitive to dust and dander. You stay in the kitchen and the laundry room. Do you understand?" Julian, who was hovering over his new daughter with tears of joy in his eyes, looked up, confused. "Sienna, Mary has been waiting all day. Let her see the baby. She's the closest thing to a grandmother this house has right now." The silence that followed was agonizing. Sienna's eyes met mine, and in them was a cold, calculated warning. "Julian, Mary is a lovely woman, but she's been working in the city's basements for decades. I won't risk the baby's health. Mary, go. Now." I retreated to the basement, the sound of my own footsteps echoing like a funeral march. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at the small, high window that looked out onto the frozen dirt of the garden. I realized then that my sacrifice had reached its limit. I had given up my name, my home, my pride, and my husband's memory. But being denied the right to love my own grandchild was a bridge too far. I looked at the floral bag sitting on the floor, the bag that still held the crumbled almond cookies and the photos of a girl who no longer existed. I realized that by staying, I wasn't helping Sienna. I was enabling her to become a monster. I began to fold my few belongings, my decision made. I would leave in the middle of the night. I would disappear back into the gray streets of the city, a ghost returning to its grave. But as I reached for my coat, I heard a muffled sob coming from the vents. It was Julian in the study directly above me, and he sounded like a man whose world was falling apart.
The sound of Julian's weeping was not the loud, performative grief of the wealthy. It was a low, jagged sound of a man discovering a rot at the foundation of his home. I dropped my coat and moved toward the service stairs, my heart heavy with a strange, protective instinct for the man who was technically my master, but had treated me with more humanity than my own flesh and blood. I crept toward the door of the mahogany-lined study. The door was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of light onto the hallway's polished floor. I peered inside, and my breath hitched. Julian wasn't just crying. He was surrounded by the ghosts of my past. On his massive oak desk lay my tattered floral bag. He must have found it in the laundry room or the pantry where I had momentarily tucked it away. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched him hold one of the old, crinkled photographs from the city. It was the picture of me, 20 years younger, sitting on a park bench with a toddler-aged Sienna. In the photo, we were both wearing the matching gold lockets, the very same locket Beatrice had questioned, and the same one Sienna had ripped from my neck. Beside the photo lay the broken gold chain and the locket itself, which Julian must have retrieved from the trash. He was comparing the photo to the jewelry, his face a mask of dawning, horrific realization. He wasn't stupid. The resemblance between the young Eleanor in the photo and the nanny Mary standing in his kitchen was undeniable. I should have run. I should have slipped out of the side door and vanished into the snowy night, leaving the lie to burn itself out. But as Julian looked up and saw my shadow in the doorway, my legs wouldn't move. "Mary?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He stood up, the photograph trembling in his hand. Or should I say, Eleanor? I stepped into the light, my head bowed, the weight of the gray uniform suddenly feeling like lead. "I'm sorry, Julian," I choked out, the tears I had suppressed for months finally spilling over. "I'd never wanted to cause you pain. I just wanted to see her. I just wanted to be near her." Julian walked toward me, his eyes searching mine with a desperate, hurt intensity. "She told me her mother died in a car accident in France. She told me she was alone in the world. She made me believe that she had no one so that I would be her everything." He held up the photo of the two of us. "Why did you do it? Why did you let her treat you like a servant? Why did you let her scrub the floors while she wore diamonds bought with the pride you gave her?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I spoke as a mother, not a maid. Because a mother's job is to protect her child, even from themselves. She was so afraid of the world you live in, Julian. She thought my poverty would be a stain you could never wash off. Julian shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. The only stain in this house, Eleanor, is the lie she told. Poverty isn't a crime, but what she did to you, that is unforgivable. He took my calloused hand in his. The masquerade is over. It's time for the truth to have its day in the sun. The grand drawing room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of $1,000 chandelier, reflecting off the crystal flutes of champagne held by the elite of the Hamptons. It was the night of the New Life Gala, a celebration Sienna had meticulously planned to debut baby Clara to their high society circle. She stood in the center of the room, draped in cream-colored silk that flowed like liquid silver, her face radiant with the triumph of a woman who had finally secured her place in the heavens. She was mid-sentence, regaling Beatrice and a group of investors with a fabricated story about her ancestral home in Europe, when the heavy oak doors at the far end of the room swung open with a force that silenced the music. Julian walked in, his face a mask of cold, unyielding iron. But it wasn't his entrance that caused the room to gasp. It was the woman at his side. He was holding my hand, not the hand of a servant, but the hand of a guest of honor. I was still in my gray uniform, my hair pulled back, my eyes red from weeping. But I stood tall. The contrast was a visual lightning bolt. Sienna's glass of champagne slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll with its paint scrubbed off. "Julian?" she stammered, her voice a thin, panicked reed. "What is this? Mary has had a breakdown. She's not well. Guards, please take her back to her quarters." But the guards didn't move. Julian stepped forward, his voice low and resonant, carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "There is no Mary," he announced, his gaze fixed on his wife with a look of profound pity. "This woman is Eleanor. She is the woman who worked 3 jobs in the dirt and the dark to put you through school. She is the woman whose husband's locket you threw in the trash. She is not the nanny, Sienna. She is your mother." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes darting between me and the childhood photo Julian now held high for everyone to see. "Sienna?" Beatrice whispered, the word sharp as a guillotine. "Is this true? Did you bring a domestic worker into this family's home and lie about her being dead?" Sienna looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. She saw the judgment, the disgust, and the crumbling of her carefully constructed empire. She turned to me, her face contorting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed, the polished accent finally slipping to reveal the raw, desperate girl from Queens. "I gave you a room. I gave you a job. You ruined everything." I looked at my daughter, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to protect her. I felt a deep, hollow sadness. "No, Sienna," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years. "I didn't ruin this. You did. You built a palace out of lies, and you expected me to be the foundation of the cellar. A mother can survive poverty, but she cannot survive being a secret." Julian turned to the room, his voice final. "The party is over. And so is this marriage. Sienna, you have 1 hour to pack. You can go back to the world you were so ashamed of. But Eleanor and my daughter are staying here. They are the only ones in this house who know what it means to be a family." The silence that followed the gala's collapse was heavier than any noise. Within 48 hours, the Thorne estate had transformed from a social fortress into a quiet, somber sanctuary. Sienna was gone. True to his word, Julian had revoked her access to the family accounts and had her escorted to a modest apartment he maintained for staff in the city, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on anyone. The divorce papers were served before the week was out. I watched from the high windows as the moving trucks took away the designer trunks and the silk gowns, leaving behind a nursery full of furniture she would never use and a husband whose heart had been hollowed out by betrayal.
The scandal was the talk of the Hamptons. But inside the house, the only thing that mattered was the soft, rhythmic breathing of baby Clara. Julian spent the first few days in a daze, sitting in the nursery with his head in his hands. One evening I approached him, no longer wearing the gray uniform, but a simple sweater and slacks he had insisted on buying for me. I placed a hand on his shoulder, and for a moment we were just two people bound by a shared grief. "You don't have to do this alone, Julian," I whispered. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "I feel like I don't know who I married, Eleanor. Was any of it real? Did she ever love me, or was I just the highest bidder for the life she wanted?" I didn't have an answer. I knew that Sienna had loved the idea of Julian, but she had been so consumed by the fear of her past that she had lost the ability to love the person. The most difficult transition was my own. After decades of being the help, sitting at the mahogany dining table felt unnatural. I would catch myself standing up to clear the plates or hovering by the kitchen door, waiting for an order that would never come. Julian's mother, Beatrice, remained a cold presence, though she no longer looked at me with suspicion. Instead, she looked at me with a strange, distant respect. "You have a resilience, Eleanor, that my daughter-in-law clearly lacked," she told me over tea one afternoon. "But don't think for a second that the Thorne name won't suffer for this. You are a reminder of a lie that nearly took us down." I looked her in the eye, no longer afraid of her diamonds. "The lie didn't nearly take you down, Beatrice. The pride did." Life settled into a new, quiet rhythm. I became the primary caregiver for Clara, but this time it was different. I sang her the old lullabies my mother had sung to me in the small village where I was born, songs about the earth, the rain, and the strength of the mountains. Julian would watch us from the doorway, a small, sad smile on his face. He began to call me Mom, a word that felt like a healing balm on a wound that had been open for 20 years. But even in this newfound peace, the ghost of Sienna haunted us. Her letters started arriving, handwritten, desperate pleas on cheap stationery, addressed to me. She talked about the cold in her apartment, the long hours at the diner where she now worked, and how much she missed the baby. I kept the letters in a drawer, unanswered. I knew that for Sienna to truly find herself, she had to live the life she had spent her whole existence running away from. She had to learn that there was no shame in the work, only in the betrayal of those who made the work possible.
The winter snow had begun to melt into a gray, slushy mess by the time the first letter arrived that I actually dared to open. It wasn't on the thick, embossed stationery Sienna had used to send out gala invitations. It was written on a piece of lined notebook paper, the edges slightly frayed. The return address was a small, cramped apartment in a part of Queens that the Hamptons elite didn't even know existed. I sat in the sunroom of the Thorne estate, the morning light hitting the marble floors, and felt a pang of familiarity as I recognized my daughter's frantic, slanted handwriting. "Mom," the letter began, the word looking shaky on the page. "I'm writing this because I don't know who else to talk to. Julian won't take my calls, and his lawyers treat me like a criminal. I'm working at a diner on 42nd Street now. My shift starts at 5 a.m. Every time I pick up a mop or wipe down a greasy counter, I see your face. I remember how your back used to ache and how you never complained. I used to think you were just built for it. I didn't realize you were breaking yourself for me. Now my own back is screaming and my hands are starting to crack from the dishwater. I see the way people look at me, or rather, the way they look through me, like I'm part of the furniture. I'm the waitress. I'm not Sienna Thorne anymore. I'm just a girl in a cheap uniform, and Mom, it's so lonely." I put the letter down, my heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and a strange sense of justice. She was finally walking in my shoes, feeling the weight of the invisibility she had forced upon me. She wrote about the cold in her apartment, the way the radiator hissed but never quite got the room warm, and how she spent her nights staring at the one photo she had managed to keep, the one of us at the park. She didn't ask for money in this letter. She didn't ask for her silk dresses back. She asked for a picture of Clara. She asked if the baby had her eyes. Julian walked in as I was folding the paper back into its envelope. He saw my expression and knew. "Another one?" he asked softly, sitting across from me. I nodded. "She's working in a diner, Julian. She's finally seeing the world from the bottom up." Julian sighed, staring out at the manicured lawn. "Is it enough, Eleanor? Does a few months of hard work erase the years of deception?" I looked at him, thinking of the girl who used to hide behind my skirts when she was little. Hard work doesn't erase the past, Julian, but it clears the vision. She's not asking for the palace anymore. She's asking for her mother. Julian reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We aren't ready yet. Clara needs stability, and you need to be Eleanor for a while longer before you can be Mom again." That night, I didn't reply to her letter, but I did something else. I went into the nursery and took a Polaroid of Clara sleeping in her crib. I didn't send it. I put it in the drawer with the letters. I knew that the bridge to be rebuilt, the foundations, had to be made of truth, not desperation. Sienna had to learn to value the woman who scrubbed the floors before she could ever deserve to be the woman who lived above them. The reality of the diner was her crucible, and as a mother, I had to let her burn until the gold was pure again.
The Blue Moon Diner was a relic of a different century, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered hardware store in the heart of Queens. It smelled of burnt coffee, stale grease, and the quiet desperation of the morning rush. Julian parked the black SUV a block away, the luxury vehicle looking like an alien craft in this landscape of cracked pavement and neon signs. He stayed in the car, his hand gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the diner's window. "I can't go in there yet, Eleanor," he said, his voice strained. "But you need to. You need to see if the woman in there is my wife or the stranger who lied to me." I stepped out into the cold morning air, my coat buttoned tight against the wind. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, a bell chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that felt out of place. There, behind the counter, was a woman who made my heart stop. It wasn't the Sienna Thorne of the Hamptons. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, practical bun, stray strands plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her skin, once glowing with expensive facials, was pale and broke out from the heat of the kitchen. She was wearing a faded blue polyester uniform with a crooked name tag that simply read Sienna. She was balancing 3 heavy plates of eggs and hash browns on one arm while pouring coffee with the other. A customer barked an order at her and she didn't flinch. She just nodded, her movements weary but efficient. I sat at a corner booth, shielding my face with a menu. I watched her work for 20 minutes. I saw her scrub a spilled milkshake off the floor without a second thought, the same girl who had once called me Mary for doing the same. I saw her take a meager tip from a construction worker with a genuine, tired thank you. When the rush finally died down, she began wiping the counter near my booth. I lowered the menu. "Sienna," I whispered. She froze, the damp rag mid-swipe. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as they landed on me. For a moment, I thought she might run, but instead her knees seemed to give way. She gripped the edge of the counter to stay upright. There were no cameras here, no Julian to impress, no social status to protect. There was just a mother and a daughter in a greasy diner at 10 a.m. "Mom?" she breathed. Her voice was cracked, stripped of the forced elegance she had spent years perfecting. She looked at my hands, then at her own, both now red, calloused, and smelling of soap. She didn't try to explain. She didn't try to lie. She simply walked around the counter and collapsed into the booth opposite me. She didn't care about the customers or the manager watching from the kitchen. She reached across the table and took my hands, her tears falling onto the Formica tabletop. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, a raw, guttural sound. "I didn't know. Mom, I stayed in the dark for so long, I forgot what the light felt like. I'm so, so sorry." In that moment, the nanny was gone, the madam was dead, and all that was left were two women who finally understood the cost of a clean floor.
The air inside the Blue Moon Diner was thick with the scent of fried onions and the heavy, humid weight of a year's worth of unsaid words. Sienna's forehead rested on our joined hands, her shoulders shaking with the kind of deep, rhythmic sobbing that comes only when a person's pride has finally been hollowed out. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the polished socialite or the cruel mistress of the Thorne estate. I saw the little girl who used to hide behind my apron when the landlord came to collect the rent. I saw the daughter who had once been my whole world. "It's okay, Sienna," I whispered, though my own voice was thick with emotion. "You're breathing the real air now. That's all I ever wanted for you." She looked up, her face a map of exhaustion and regret. "I used to hate the smell of your clothes when you came home from work, Mom," she choked out, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I hated the way you smelled like bleach in other people's houses. Now I smell like this diner every night, and it's the only thing that feels honest. I deserve this. I deserve to be invisible." I shook my head, squeezing her fingers. "No one deserves to be invisible, Sienna, not even the people who make mistakes. You didn't just hide me, you hid yourself." Just then, the bell over the door chimed. I looked over my shoulder and saw Julian standing there. He had stepped out of the luxury SUV and into the reality of her new life. He looked strikingly out of place in his tailored wool coat, standing amidst the cracked vinyl booths. Sienna saw him and let out a small, terrified gasp, instinctively trying to smooth her messy hair and straighten her stained uniform. But then she stopped. She let her hands fall to her sides and stood up, facing him without the mask. Julian walked toward us slowly, his eyes scanning the grease-stained walls and the tired woman standing before him. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked profoundly sad. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze lingering on her name tag, the one that simply said, Sienna. "I saw the photo, Sienna," he said quietly, referring to the Polaroid I had sent. "I saw the back of it. She has your eyes. I spent all night looking at Clara, trying to find you in her, and I realized that if I keep you away, I'm just as guilty of rewriting history as you were." Sienna couldn't speak. She just stood there, a waitress in a cheap diner, trembling under the gaze of the man she had betrayed. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold locket, the one he had repaired. He set it on the table between us. "The locket belongs to Eleanor," he said, looking at me, then back at her. "But the truth belongs to all of us. I'm not saying I can forget Sienna, and I'm certainly not saying you're coming back to the Hamptons today. But Clara deserves to know her mother, the real one, not the concert pianist from the Swiss Alps, but the woman who knows what it means to work for a living." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I'll be at the park with Eleanor and Clara on Sunday at 2 p.m. If you can get the shift off, you should come. But come as yourself." As the door closed behind him, Sienna sank back into the booth, clutching the repaired locket to her chest. The drive back to the light wasn't going to be a luxury car ride. It was going to be a long, slow walk through the truth. Sunday arrived with a sky the color of a robin's egg, crisp and clear. The park we chose was a neutral ground, a vibrant public space in Brooklyn, where the laughter of children from every walk of life filled the air. Julian sat on a wooden bench, his eyes shielded by sunglasses, his posture stiff with a lingering, protective caution. I sat beside him, the stroller parked between us. Clara was awake, her tiny hands reaching for the sunlight filtering through the budding trees. I checked my watch every 30 seconds, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. I wondered if Sienna would show up, or if the shame of being seen in the daylight was still too heavy for her to carry. At exactly 2:10 p.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the path. She wasn't in a chauffeured car, she had come by the subway. Sienna looked different, smaller somehow, but more substantial. She wore a simple pair of jeans and a plain navy coat, her face scrubbed clean of the heavy makeup she used to wear like armor. As she approached the bench, her footsteps slowed. She looked at Julian,
then at me, and finally her gaze fell upon the stroller. The air between us seemed to hum with the weight of everything that had been broken. "Hi," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of a nearby ice cream truck. Julian didn't stand up, but he nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. Sienna moved toward the stroller as if she were approaching a holy relic. She knelt on the grass, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch Clara's tiny foot. Clara let out a soft, melodic coo and kicked her legs, her wide, curious eyes locking onto Sienna's face. In that moment, the world of the Hamptons, the lies of the Blue Bloods, and the gray uniform of Nanny Mary vanished. There was only a mother seeing her child through the eyes of the truth. Sienna began to weep, not the frantic, loud sobs of the diner, but a quiet, cleansing rain. "She's beautiful, Mom," she said, looking up at me. "She's so perfect." Julian cleared his throat, his voice rough. "She has your stubbornness, Sienna, and your eyes. I just hope she grows up with her grandmother's heart." Sienna flinched at the mention of my heart, knowing she had nearly broken it beyond repair. She stayed on the grass for an hour, playing with Clara's fingers and whispering apologies into the wind. We didn't talk about the divorce or the future. We didn't talk about the money. We just sat in the sun and watched the baby. It was the first time in years that we were all in the same space without a lie standing between us like a wall. As the shadows began to lengthen, Sienna stood up and brushed the grass from her jeans. She looked at Julian with a sad, steady gaze. "Thank you for letting me see her. I'll go back to work now. I have a double shift tonight." Julian looked at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "The diner isn't a life sentence, Sienna. It's a beginning." As she walked back toward the subway station, I realized that the healing hadn't fully happened yet, but the infection had been cleared. The daughter I had lost was gone, and the woman replacing her was someone I could finally recognize as my own.
The following weeks were a whirlwind of hushed meetings in glass-walled offices, but the atmosphere had shifted from one of war to one of somber resolution. Julian's lawyers, who had initially been instructed to strip Sienna of everything, were given new orders. The divorce was finalized not with a public scandal, but with a quiet, dignified settlement. Julian decided not to cast her back into total poverty, nor did he return her to the lap of luxury. Instead, he established a modest trust for her, just enough for a small, safe apartment and the ability to return to school. It wasn't a Thorne lifestyle, it was a Martha lifestyle, one of independence earned through the truth. One afternoon, I sat in the study as Julian reviewed the final documents. He looked at me, the pen hovering over the signature line. "I'm giving her the chance to be the woman she pretended to be, Eleanor," he said. "Not the fake heiress, but the educated, capable woman you worked so hard for her to become. But this time, she has to do the work herself. No more shortcuts, no more shadows." I felt a profound sense of peace. My daughter was finally being given the one thing I could never give her myself, a clean slate that wasn't built on my exhaustion. As the legal ties of their marriage were severed, a new, fragile thread began to weave between us. Sienna moved out of the cramped Queen's apartment and into a small studio near a community college. She kept her job at the diner for 3 nights a week, refusing to give up the work that had grounded her. She began to visit the estate once a week, not as the mistress of the house, but as a guest. She would sit in the kitchen with me, and we would prepare dinner together. No gray uniform, no ma'am, no Mary. Just Eleanor and Sienna, 2 women peeling potatoes and talking about the future. The most beautiful moment came when Beatrice Thorne invited Sienna to tea. It was a cold, formal affair at first, but as they sat in the sunroom, Beatrice handed Sienna an old leather-bound book. "This is the Thorne family history," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of its usual sting. "It is filled with men and women who did great things, but also many who did terrible things to keep their secrets. You are the first one who had the courage to lose everything to find the truth. That makes you more of a Thorne than the name ever did.
Sienna cried that day, not out of shame, but out of a strange new sense of belonging. She realized that she didn't have to hide her mother to be worthy of a palace. She just had to be a daughter worthy of her mother. The winter had finally surrendered to a vibrant, blooming spring, and with the return of the birds came the most anticipated day of the year, Clara's first birthday. The Thorne estate was usually a place of rigid professional events, but today the atmosphere was different. There were no caterers in white gloves, no guest list of business tycoons, and no press. Instead, the smell of my own homemade vanilla cake wafted through the halls, the same recipe I used for Sienna 25 years ago in our cramped Queen's kitchen. Julian had insisted on a small, intimate gathering in the garden, a celebration that prioritized heart over heritage. As I decorated the outdoor table with simple wildflowers, I noticed Julian standing near the rose bushes, looking at a single empty chair he had placed at the head of the table. It wasn't for a guest, it was a symbol. He looked at me and offered a sad, knowing smile. "A year ago, Eleanor, this chair would have been filled by a lie," he said softly. "Today, it's empty because we finally have room for the truth." We both knew that while the divorce was final and the legal battles were over, the seat Sienna used to occupy in this house could never be reclaimed in the same way. She was coming today, but she was coming as a visitor, a woman still earning her way back into the center of our lives. Sienna arrived at noon, carrying a small hand-wrapped box. She looked healthy. Her skin had regained its natural glow, and her eyes no longer held the frantic, haunted look of a fugitive. She greeted Beatrice with a respectful nod and walked over to me, giving me a hug that lasted a long time. It was a hug of equals, two women who had survived a storm. When she saw Clara, who was now crawling with a fierce determination, Sienna's face transformed. She knelt in the grass, laughing as the baby pulled at her hair. For a few hours, the pain of the Nanny Mary months seemed to evaporate into the warm spring air. However, the reality of our new life was never far away. During the cake cutting, one of the longtime gardeners, an elderly man who had witnessed my time as the help, walked by. He tipped his hat to me and said, "Good to see you in the sun, Miss Eleanor." Sienna flinched, her eyes dropping to the grass. The reminder of her cruelty was a shadow that followed her even into the light. She looked at the empty chair Julian had placed, then at me. "I don't deserve to sit at this table yet, do I, Mom?" she whispered. I took her hand, the one that still bore the faint scars of diner work. "The table isn't about what you deserve, Sienna. It's about being present. You're here. That's the first victory." As the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the lawn, Julian raised a glass. "To Clara," he said, his voice ringing out. "May she grow up knowing that her family's strength doesn't come from the stone of this house, but from the honesty of the people inside it." Sienna looked at him, and for the first time, there was no spark of ambition in her gaze, only a quiet, profound respect. She wasn't the queen of the Hamptons anymore, and I wasn't the ghost in the basement. We were just a family, broken and glued back together, sitting in a garden that finally felt like home.
3 years had passed since the night the nanny mask was stripped away, and the seasons had been kind to our healing. The Thorne estate was no longer a cold museum of secrets. It had become a place of muddy boots, Clara's finger paintings on the fridge, and the smell of my home cooking. But today, we were not at the estate. We were standing in the courtyard of a community college in the city. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the nervous energy of hundreds of students in black robes. My heart felt as though it might burst out of my chest as I adjusted the locket around my neck, the one Julian had fixed, which now held a new photo, one of Eleanor, Julian, Sienna, and Clara. Sienna stood among the graduates, her golden hair tucked under a mortarboard. She had spent the last 3 years working double shifts at the diner while taking night classes in social work. She hadn't taken a penny from Julian for her tuition. She had paid for every credit with the tips she earned by serving coffee to the very people she once looked down upon. As her name was called, Sienna Eleanor Thorne, she walked across the stage with a grace that didn't come from silk or diamonds, but from the quiet dignity of a woman who had finally found her own feet. When she received her diploma, she didn't look at the cameras or the professors. She looked straight into the crowd, locking eyes with me. After the ceremony, we met under a large oak tree. Julian was there, holding a 4-year-old Clara on his shoulders. Beatrice stood beside us, looking more regal than ever, though she was carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. When Sienna reached us, she didn't head for Julian first. She walked straight to me and placed her graduation cap on my head. "This belongs to you, Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You were the first one to graduate from the school of sacrifice. I'm just finally catching up." I held her, feeling the solid, honest weight of my daughter in my arms. The shame that had once driven us apart had been replaced by a pride so thick it felt like a physical shield. Julian stepped forward, looking at his ex-wife with a warmth that had taken years to cultivate. He wasn't the man she had betrayed anymore, and she wasn't the woman who had lied. They were two parents who had survived a wreck and decided to build something new from the timber. "We're going to dinner, Sienna," Julian said, offering her a hand. "A real dinner, at the apartment in Queens. Eleanor is cooking, and for the first time, we're all sitting at the same table. No empty chairs." Sienna smiled, and for the first time I saw the girl I had raised, the one who wasn't afraid of where she came from. As we walked toward the car, Clara tugged at my hand. "Grandma, why is Mommy crying?" she asked in her sweet, high voice. I picked her up, kissing her cheek, which smelled of sunlight and soap. "Because, my darling," I told her, "sometimes you have to lose your way in the woods just to realize how much you love the house you started from." We drove away from the college, leaving the nanny Mary and the gilded Sienna in the past. We were heading back to the city, to the neighborhood where my hands had first started to crack. But this time, the cracked skin wasn't a mark of poverty, it was a badge of honor for a family that had finally learned how to tell the truth. 10 years have passed since the night I walked through the servants' entrance of the Thorne estate, and today I sit on a different porch. It is a modest wraparound veranda of a house in a quiet neighborhood, not a mansion, but a home. The wood is painted a soft white, and the garden is a riot of chaotic, beautiful colors, much like the life we've built. I am no longer Mary, and I am no longer just a ghost in a gray uniform. I am Eleanor, and for the first time in my 70 years, I am simply at rest. Sienna lives nearby. She is a senior social worker now, specializing in helping women who, like me years ago, are trying to navigate the crushing weight of systemic poverty. She doesn't wear diamonds anymore. She wears a silver bracelet Clara made her and a look of deep-seated contentment. Watching her work is like watching a woman repay a debt to the universe. She doesn't hide her past, she uses it as a bridge to reach people who feel invisible. She often tells her clients, "My mother was a domestic worker, and she is the most powerful woman I've ever known." Every time I hear it, the old stings of the madam years fade a little more. Julian and Sienna never remarried, but they found something perhaps more enduring, a profound, respectful friendship. They co-parent Clara with a harmony that the blue bloods of the Hamptons still don't understand. Julian eventually stepped away from the high-pressure Legacy Foundation to start a nonprofit that funds affordable housing,
a move inspired by the stories I told him about the basements and the walk-ups of Queens. We are a family forged in a fire that should have consumed us, but instead it burned away everything that wasn't real. Clara is 14 now. She is fierce, kind, and remarkably grounded. This morning, she sat with me on the porch, helping me snap green beans for dinner. She looked at my hands, my old, gnarled hands that have scrubbed 1,000 floors, and she didn't look away. She took one of my hands in hers and kissed the knuckles. "Tell me again, Grandma," she said softly, "about the night the truth came home." I looked out at the street where the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the neighborhood. I thought about the floral bag, the broken locket, and the cold gray uniform. I thought about the daughter I lost and the woman I found. "The truth didn't just come home that night, Clara," I told her, pulling her close. "The truth freed us. It took the nanny and the madam and turned them back into a mother and a daughter. And that is the only legacy worth leaving." As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the earth. The floors were clean, the children were safe, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next shift to begin. I was already home.